what explains specifically the naivete of Americans vis-a-vis the game theory of negotiation?
You know, it's so startlingly bad, America's capacity to negotiate in the Middle East, that I share with you the desperate desire for an explanation. Because I can't believe that these national security officials never bought a house. I can't believe they never negotiated a loan. I cannot believe they don't understand, right? That my 5-year-old daughter in her kindergarten negotiates properly in ways that this administration hasn't in the Middle East, and the frustration of that. I have my suspicions, but this is really getting way beyond anything I know, and both of you will know more about what happens in Washington. But as an outside observer, I think two things. One, when people like Petraeus and McMaster and John Spencer of West Point, when they talk, I learn. Mm-hmm. And they have explained to us Israelis some things about, that the Israeli army doesn't necessarily say out loud, because some of this is secret and some of this is analytical, and about some of the conduct of the war. Now, I'm very close to the war. I was myself in the infantry. I am very familiar with the tactics and strategies, and I have two brothers-in-law who were literally in the war, and I have learned from some of these genuine American experts on what is going on in that war. That's not the people who are actually in the administration making the analytical decisions and analyses and assessments. I suspect that a lot of it is that there is an addiction to theory. They come out of universities, they've read a bunch of books, and they have models based on other examples in history. We've heard a lot about other wars, a lot about Afghanistan, a lot about Iraq. And if that's, what is that old saying? If all you have is a hammer, everything's a nail, something like that, right? And so the idea that Hamas is a threat unlike anything anyone has ever faced. It is at its core basically a guerrilla military, right? There's this tunnel system. They're hiding. They want their own civilian deaths because that's their force multiplier. That's very similar to the Viet Cong in theory. It's not that dissimilar from ISIS in Mosul, Algeria, and the FLN in Algeria against the French. It's not that it doesn't rhyme with those conflicts. No one in the history of warfare has faced this scale of tunnels, this scale of a strategy of placing civilians in harm's way, by which I mean all of Gaza for 17 years was built into this battlefield. Hamas for 17 years built nothing else in Gaza and bent the entire economy of Gaza to what is essentially the single biggest thing Palestinians have ever built. These tunnels are, 500 miles? They're like 1.5 times the London Tube system. They're astonishing. And so at that scale, it's a different kind of war. And if all you've ever done is read a few books, Marines who walked through Fallujah in 2007 understand this battle in a way that the analysts at the National Security Council, I think, don't. So I'm going to pin it on that. Are there other cultural things, like they wish that Hamas, some of these officials, they don't want it to be winnable because so much of this current generation of American policy analysts have grown up on unwinnableness in war. I don't. That's a kind of cultural critique I suspect might have some connection to the truth, but I don't know the people enough to say it seriously.
I'll add 3 things to it quickly. And the first thing is that we do have real incompetence there, as we saw with the way they pulled out of Afghanistan. There was really no way to sugarcoat that kind of debacle when they had everything within their own control to go on their own schedule. Number one. Number two, the way they handled the run-up to Ukraine, where they essentially told Putin, well, right this way, sir, as long as you don't mind some economic sanctions, go ahead and do what you will. They never really rattled any sabers at him. And number 3, if you, I should have prepared the quote. I have Robert Gates's, Obama's defense secretary and also Bush's defense secretary memoir. And in it, he discusses that Joe Biden, and he was very bothered by this, always was more concerned about the politics than the military strategy. In any kind of discussion about what America should or shouldn't do, Biden was always worried about what the political ramifications would be over and above all other concerns. And for him to write that and put it in a memoir, and is very profound to me. It means he really felt it. So, and that's what we're seeing, right? At least to some extent.
I want to expand it beyond Biden, because the experience of the Middle East, of America for the last 30 years has been a kind of schizophrenia in policy terms. We have watched, America had a policy, and then the administration changed, let's say from Clinton to Bush, and then it became an anti-policy, just the antithesis. And then after Bush, Obama came to power, and what was Obama's Middle East policy? Not being Bush. And then when Trump came to power, what was his Middle East policy? What's the strategy? Not being Obama became the strategy. And with Biden, things stabilized a little bit because there's that deep background that Biden could, but not at the beginning. At the beginning, the Abraham Accords were no-go, were something he refused to touch for 2 years. And then he comes back and says, well, this is actually low-hanging fruit. Why am I not sharing in the glory, right? And now he wants to advance it, but he wasted 2 years. And that sense that America's foreign policy is entirely domestic politics is everywhere in the Middle East. And the tragedy is that the Middle East actually needs a superpower with a strategy. We have in the Middle East the best. I'm sorry, just 1 minute, and I apologize. I'm an Israeli. I speak
Please,
in speeches.
we
I
love
expect
it.
to be
Go ahead.
interrupted violently. The Middle East is divided into 4 grand alliances. If you look at the Middle East and you see nation states with clear borders and capitals, you're missing the fundamental way most people think in the Middle East and most people live in the Middle East. The Middle East is divided into 4 basic cultural, religious, ethnic alliances. One is the conservative Sunnis in the Middle East, in the Arab Middle East, which is all the kings, right? The Saudis, the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, the Jordanians, the Moroccans. The Sunni conservatives stand together. In the Syrian civil war, they supported the same, 3 factions out of the 11 factions of that war. In Iraq, in Palestinian politics, they support Fatah, they support everywhere in the Middle East, they stand together. Then you have the radical Sunnis, the Muslim Brothers, the Salafists, and they always everywhere stand together. If you ever wonder why the Turks in the Syrian civil war, not that people know this in America, but you should know this in America because it's a NATO ally. The Turks supported the branches of Al-Qaeda fighting in the Syrian civil war. Why? Because the Turkish government, the AKP party of Erdogan, is a Muslim Brotherhood ideological party, and it works with Hamas and with Qatar, which is also a Salafist Muslim Brotherhood party, and the branches, the various branches of Al Qaeda, are in that similar radical Sunni vein. Third alliance, the Shia led by Iran. Fourth alliance is my favorite because it's mine. It's called let's call it Other, okay? And that fourth alliance has a lot of the non-Arab Muslims, a lot of the non-Muslim Arabs, the Jews, the Druze. If you go to northern Iraq and talk to Kurds, you will find a surprising amount of pro-Israel sentiment. When Jabhat al-Nusra, the al-Qaeda affiliate in the Syrian civil war, is coming down the Golan Plateau, I think in 2015 or so, and heading very close to the Druze villages of southern Syria, the Druze in Israel talk to the government of Israel, and the government of Israel, which is to say, I'm putting this in air quotes, the Jews, say out loud, we're going to protect the Jews of southern Syria. In other words, everywhere you go in the Middle East, these 4 alliances stand. Hamas represents the very first radical Sunni faction that is embedded in the Shia coalition of Iran. And it is an absolute alliance of those 2 groups, and they're working together in multiple places. And the Abraham Accords, which are basically an initiative of the Saudis more than anybody else, represents the other and the conservative Sunnis uniting in response. The Middle East is dividing into a vast alliance structure. And in this moment, where so much is at stake and nations are being demolished, what the Iranian proxy in Yemen has done to Yemen in the last 10 years, no enemy of Yemen has ever done to Yemen. You cannot, even though you are trying, fix Lebanon at the rate that Hezbollah is demolishing Lebanon. Nations are being destroyed in this vast alliance system that is forming now, and which Gaza is just one battlefield, but it's currently the main battlefield, and America has no strategy. So there's a tragedy to this incompetence. There's a tragedy to the overwhelming of American foreign policy by domestic politicking.